Good afternoon. Welcome to episode 6 of In the Loop. Today we're going to be discussing legal contracting and approaches to developing SAF development projects. We're also going to have a really great new case study and development by Syntholene, down at Syntholene. My name is Sarah Wilkin. I am founder and CEO of Fly Green Alliance and also the host of In the Loop. We are gathering insights and information, market signals, cross-sector insights, and we share this with our network. We have a YouTube channel and a membership base, and we are growing our ecosystem to make sure the information is shared as widely as possible to develop the sustainable aviation fuel market. What I have been doing over these last years is speaking at a lot of different events. It gives me great opportunity to gather insights and information, and then this is useful to our members. So I've spoken all over Economist, CERAWeek, and so this is what I then deliver back to our members so that we can all develop the market together. So today we will be discussing, we'll go into a little bit on the mandates. Syntholene is using geothermal power, so that is also a really interesting, a new kind of project. And then Ryan from White Case, who has a real great portfolio and a lot of experience in SAF contracting, is going to take us through some of these details and give us some advisory as well. Actually, a bit of context. This is what we are working towards, and it is, of course, the development of the SAF market. It is scaling the projects to, by 2050, get to a 70% displacement of fossil fuel, of course, for environmental purposes and for decarbonisation of the aviation industry. As we now know, due to more recent conflict, it is also for energy resilience and energy security. So it is the original reason sustainable aviation fuel was developed. And again, because it's very much in the news, it just reaffirms that we do need to develop the industry for multiple reasons. So this is what we are working towards. Then what IATA did do last year was bring out a feedstock report. It was an updated report. It was evolving some topics, and it then delved further into supply chain and reliability of low-cost renewable electricity as well as hydrogen. And this is what Dan will discuss with us. So this was a real good acknowledgement of further needs of the industry, and it hadn't been acknowledged before. It also we'd invited IATA to a launch of our initiative, the Nuclear for eFuels initiative, because we were also with Hydrogen Energy Association and Nuclear Hydrogen Initiative. We were seeing that the cross-sector work was missing, and actually the baseload need of electricity needed to be explored, developed, strategies needed to evolve, as well as plans to do that work. So this all again is context as to why all of these topics do need developing, and then as many cases and the list of portfolio that Ryan has, the better, because it shows that the work it's not first of its kind, and it's going from first of its kind to in practice, in operation, and that's exactly what we need to get to FID and to develop the industry. So a bit of background. I won't go too much into the baseload need because Dan will also discuss this. But this again is the needs as the risk is intermittency of renewable energy. Risks are ownership of supply chain. So there's so many risks involved. This is a bit of the process flow, but again, I won't heavily go into this. This is demonstrating that geothermal can be an input into this process, and that the output is an eFuel at the end of it, and then that goes into be a jet fuel. I do want to point out as well, before we go into the discussion with Dan, that there has been some recent developments by the European Commission on carbon removals, and that was just from May, which means it's starting to embed in cement as an industry and also a decarbonisation approach for aviation. So this is significant, and this will also support the e-fuel market. The e-fuels do require CO2, and that needs to be managed and supplied at the right time and the right price and the right place. So this is also a bit of context as to why we're having this discussion and sharing this information today. So I want to hand over to Dan, co-founder and CEO of Syntholene. And Dan, if you want to tell us about yourself and Syntholene, it would be great to hear more from you and your developments.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Sarah. And thanks to all of you for giving me the opportunity to share with my newfound colleagues at Fly Green Alliance. Very pleased to have joined you all to advance this mission of scalable, low-cost, carbon-neutral synthetic jet fuel that's actually better quality jet fuel than we would get from fossil-based hydrocarbons. It's interesting that the molecular purity of e-fuels is superior. So regardless of one's views on climate change, it's actually a better quality fuel. But in this instance, we know that we need to be able to address some of the core concerns that are preventing this industry from materially scaling up. And in the conversations I've had, those concerns really consistently boil back to cost. The fuel's too expensive for airlines to buy it voluntarily. Even with mandated obligations, they're still struggling to justify offtake agreements that are oftentimes 5, 7, 10 times more expensive than conventional jet fuel. Even with supply shocks into the jet fuel market, there's new headlines every day talking about the increase of especially European jet fuel and how it's going to affect summer travel. Interestingly, in a cruel twist of economics, it's also too expensive for banks and industrial investors to meaningfully invest in the scale up of synthetic fuels and e-fuels. And so we're in this very strange sort of stagflation moment where it's very expensive for airlines to buy and too expensive to justify investment in infrastructure. And Syntholene is really proud to be bringing a technology through active commercialization now that is structurally capable of addressing these cost concerns, and the first that I've seen that can actually scale to cost competition with fossil fuels. Now, this technology is well established. We're not doing anything new in terms of our infrastructure. We're not even really technologists as a company. We've done a few core innovations that we needed to do to be able to essentially link low-cost, baseload, thermally intensive energy, such as that we find in nuclear and in geothermal, and then pair that to high efficiency systems that take advantage of that thermal energy availability to produce low cost synthetic fuels. This was really born out of the Idaho National Lab, where my engineering colleagues worked through the 2010s and into the early 2020s. And they showed the integration of this really important step change advancement in electrolysis technology called the solid oxide electrolyzer cell. I'm sure many of you would be familiar with that. It is a high temperature system that increases efficiencies relative to more conventional electrolysis about 40% just with electricity use alone. So already better than proton-electron membrane and better than alkaline systems, which have kind of been the traditional incumbents for electrolysis, which enables hydrogen production, the key ingredient, probably about 70% of the e-fuel cost base. But the SOEC has another feature, and that is it can accept priming heat. So instead of using electricity alone, the SOEC enables this thermally integrated strategy where you can have some of your energy coming from heat and some of your energy coming from electricity. Now, this only really matters if you have co-located production of heat and electricity. And this SOEC lab that was built out in the Idaho National Lab conceived of this co-located energy source as nuclear power. And we are big on nuclear power. My team actually comes from 20 years in the nuclear industry. I started my career in small modular nuclear reactors.
Yeah.
Wait for the day where we can get efficiently priced, easy to build small modular reactors coming off a production line and supplying these kinds of e-fuels. But if I'm going to put my conservative hat on, I would estimate that that's at least sort of 5 years, maybe 10 years away for most Western nations. Seems like the United States is pushing really quickly. A few new reactors are going to reach criticality just this month and next month, which is incredible. But in the meantime, there is another energy source. And geothermal energy is sort of the Earth's nuclear reactor.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so it is interesting, Dan, that it's kind of actually what is happening with SMRs, and now some development is there as to how it can. Actually, the recent World Nuclear Association events I've been at is where everybody is. Well, I've definitely been putting it in there on their agenda, but it is an interesting output. So it's that when I learned about Syntholene, it was interesting that you follow, basically your history is following that path, but actually you've seen a way to accelerate that by harnessing geothermal. Is that correct? Is that the right way to think of it?
It is absolutely the right way. And along that journey, we've come to understand that geothermal, although not as geographically convenient as nuclear, if we envision the ideal future for small modular reactors that are passively safe, that have a low risk profile, they can be very low cost, and they're obviously don't create carbon emissions. We want to see those all over the world. Geothermal is geographically constrained, or rather the specific character of geothermal that we really like. It only exists in a handful of places around the world, and none better than Iceland. So this geothermal needs to be pretty hot, it needs to be pretty shallow, and it needs to be abundantly scalable. And Iceland has that amazing combination. They've got lots of groundwater. They've got a political motivation towards more energy independence. So it's kind of this perfect storm of confluence of factors that lead to success. But it also does allow us to test these thermal integration pathways without having to wait until there's SMRs, high temperature nuclear reactors, that are available commercially. And that's exactly what we're doing and what we have done. So we started in the lab at INL. The INL results of this thermal integration pathway were nothing short of groundbreaking. The pathway to green hydrogen below $1 per kilogram, which quite literally enables synthetic fuel cheaper than fossil-based equivalents. This is like a civilizational level unlock. And I feel like those results from that lab work, which are publicly available, didn't get near the attention that they deserve. But in discussions with industrial investors, energy super majors, what we came to understand is the lab work is not sufficient. It's not a sufficient proof point for justification of billions of dollars of industrial scale-up investment. And what they need to see is what we have just done. And that is building a real-world demonstration facility. We're about to turn the lights on. We're about to start operations at the end of this month. Very quick construction project facilitated by our fantastic project management team, as well as the Icelandic government and the regional government in Husavik and in the north. And this will demonstrate in the field for the first time that we can use heat and electricity from a geothermal resource to match and perhaps even outperform the results that happened at INL. So this really is, in our view, the only pathway to cost-competitive, scalable synthetic fuel. It's cheaper than biofuel. Infeasibly, it could be cheaper than conventional fossil-based fuels within the next 5 years. And that is Syntholene's core mission, core mandate. We will accomplish it or we will die trying, proving that we can make synthetic fuels, specifically eSAF, cheaper than fossil-based counterparts.
Well, that is interesting to banks and investors, of course. So, and then you mentioned you have had a lot of support from the Icelandic government. I think even you mentioned you, of course, built your relationships over the last few years. I think you said Syntholene was, even though you've been doing the work for some years, Syntholene as a company was, what was it, 2022 or 3 you were formed? And then
the lab work goes back into the sort of mid 2010s, but we formed the company to commercialize the lab work in 2023. That's correct.
Yeah. And then you said once you had got to know Icelandic policy and government, that actually the permitting was a matter of weeks.
That is correct.
Yeah.
So we did a lot of groundwork to get everybody socialized to the idea and prove our credibility, prove our bankability, safety standards, code standards, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But by the time we actually had the formal package together, submitted it to our municipality for approval, it was quite literally 2.5 weeks to get that permit. And that permit in the EU would reasonably take years. In the United States, it would take years feasibly.
Yeah.
So just a testament to how ambitious Iceland really is, and that they're willing to stand behind that ambition with actual material policy action.
Yeah, and get approval, very quick approvals. And is Iceland open? Is there more opportunity for projects such as ESAF projects there? Would you
There
say?
absolutely is. If you want to capitalize the most effectively on Iceland's resources, then I'd highly recommend our thermal integration route. Being able to use heat as that priming temperature and then net less electricity. And electricity for industrial users is very low cost. And as you mentioned, Sarah, it's also base load available.
Yeah.
Geothermal has the advantage of a very low intermittency factor. Assuming you've got the right water, heat, pressure character, you're able to access that energy. They say 95% intermittency or low intermittency. I think it's more like 100%. It's as close to nuclear power as you're going to get.
Yeah.
And so that allows for continuous industrial operations without having to spool up and spool down. So a pretty significant advantage over wind and solar. It's not just the cost, which is also higher with wind and solar, but also that intermittency for sure.
Yeah, and so I have been working with the UK National Nuclear Lab on also developing some SAF education work. And even in the UK, it is an issue of the grid. The grid is essentially two capacity needs, infrastructure needs building. And if new projects are coming online, there is a waiting list which stretches to 2033 in the UK. So these are the kinds of policy infrastructure limitations. So of course, if any of when we're talking about baseload, this is what the grid should be supplying, and what has happened recently with actually the likes of data centers. They are now investing in SMRs. And what is called virtual power plants to essentially have an off-grid solution to securing decarbonized energy supply for the future. So so opportunities such as geothermal, which then can be leveraged further, is very attractive for the economics, as your group have obviously rightly seen leverage, Dan. So that it's an interesting case study because it is accelerating the it's pre-nuclear opportunity. And so what's your timeline? What would you say? You say demonstration is going into construction. What's your stage?
The demonstration construction is almost complete. About 77 days from permits to operations.
Wow.
We're pretty good at complex construction projects, and this one is relatively small, but I think that's a key differentiator for Syntholene is we've got a lot of history deploying advanced energy infrastructure and complex infrastructure. So we're not really a lab team. We're pretty good in the lab, but we like to build stuff and we like to build it quickly. Yeah. That demonstration facility will have an effects testing campaign, essentially validating our efficiencies, our thermal integration pathway through the summertime. And then we will third-party validate that data and be able to demonstrate, okay, did these efficiencies work the same way they did in the lab? Even if we're within striking distance of the INL results, this is nothing short of a step change advancement in the cost reduction of synthetic fuels. And of course, it is geographically constrained. So you can't just do this anywhere. You've got to do it where the energy is high temperature and low cost. And so grid connection based on our economic analysis, whether it's in France or in the UK or in Nordic states, it's just very unlikely that you're going to get a meaningful cost advantage over what's going on now. And what's going on now is simply not functional. We cannot scale synthetic fuel production with the current unit economics. They need to get better, and not a few percent better, like they need to get meaningfully better. So this isn't really different than fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are not decentralized. They are geographically constrained, where you have low lifting costs in the Middle East. That then takes advantage of 150 years worth of distribution infrastructure, tankers, pipelines. We move them all over the world. Most of the jet fuel from Europe comes from the Middle East at some level. And so, yes, we absolutely need to find the right technologies. Sure, we have this technological advantage of the SOEC and our ability to thermally integrate to that. But it's also a story about co-locating to efficient power resources and the right character of power resources. So I think the idea that co-locating synthetic fuel production in some of the jurisdictions with the most expensive energy prices in Europe is not really the right fit. You mentioned data centers. They will outbid synthetic fuel producers. Yeah. Guaranteed. Yeah. We're talking about Google, Meta, all these massive hyperscalers. They are, as much as they are investing in Europe, they're going to pay premium prices, and they've been bolstered by their shareholders and exceptional valuations to be able to overpay in the immediate term. So we got to be really conscious of doing this in the right place. Yeah. Rachel, I noticed your hand came up.
Rachel.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Dan, for this overview. I have a question around the costs and cost point of CO2 capture, technology cost point, and your experience in deploying it in this project that you described. Can you highlight those to us?
CO2 capture is exceptionally expensive. It has not scaled meaningfully over the last 10 years where it was supposed to. There are some regions with structural cost advantages, especially in the current slate of technologies, which really do have to come back to point source capture from resources like pulp and paper mills, waste incinerators. There's sort of a handful of functional economics that, even though they're expensive now, we do have a view to how to scale them down. We take a strong interest in direct air capture and direct ocean capture, which is, I think, a technology that's often underexplored. But even point source capture, which is supposed to be the most scalable, the most efficient, is still in the kind of 200, 250 euros plus per ton right now. So we don't mind overpaying a bit for CO2. Hydrogen really is the most meaningful cost impact. And so if you can get cheap hydrogen, you can sustain more expensive CO2 for a time. Regional CO2 is difficult in Iceland, although we do have a few resources where it looks like we're going to be able to at least get sort of 20,000 tons of eFuel production stood up with local domestic production. But that pathway for CO2 capture, whether it be point source capture, direct capture, towards that $100 a ton, $100 a ton, or $50 a ton. I've seen some people talk about that. That is like one of the most critical unlocks for the future of human civilization. We need to see it. I think it's probably 5 to 10 years away.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I've been invited to a dinner by a carbon removal startup next week. So it's interesting. They are for sure interested in the strategy for aviation decarbonisation and most likely for e-fuel. So I will also send this recording on to them, and it would be interesting to join that conversation. But of course, it's all linked to the economics. So Richard, would you like to make a comment? I see your hand up, Richard.
You are muted.
Maybe it was oh, hi, Richard.
Got me?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the explanation, Dan. Dan, what percentage of the SAF market do you see the technology applying to, over what period of time?
So we focus in on the eSAF sub-mandate. Biofuel and biosaf are playing an important role today. I think they're going to run into some inherent scaling limitations. There's just not enough feedstocks to meaningfully substitute even 1% of total aviation fuel if you could capture all the waste feedstock in the world. And the more biosaf you produce, the more expensive the feedstocks get. They also do compete with other uses for those feedstocks. You want to grow corn to make biosaf, you're taking corn off somebody else's plate. So I think we're starting to understand the physical and inherent limitations. So eSAF is often cited as the only scalable pathway, but it's sure not scalable when it costs 10 times as much as fossil fuels. So can Syntholene eat the entire demand for synthetic aviation fuel in just the sub-mandated categories, looks like about a $2 billion undersupply of about a $4 billion market, assuming a few more of these projects get online by 2030. That jumps to about $20 billion worth of undersupply by 2035, assuming the mandates are stable. So we'd love to do our part. We'd love to license our technology. We'd love to see it, scale. But this is a huge, engineering project development mandate, many, many billions, tens of billions of dollars worth of infrastructure. So while I love the idea that our technology is bankable, repeatable, it's modular, we can build as much of it as we want, I'm really focused on our first 20,000 tons per year. If we can make that facility profitable, meaningfully profitable for investors, not doing it because you're morally obligated or doing it because the mandates make it happen, but actually make it a smart investment choice, then repeating it will deliver economies of scale that make it even more economically compelling. And so I think ESAF's the only real way, and I think a meaningful cost reduction in ESAF that we hope to deliver is the gating step to enabling large-scale production.
Yeah, and that's
So
what
no-
is interesting. Oh, sorry, Richard, go ahead.
Sorry, forgive me. So in other words, we have a situation where you're feeling you can get to somewhere near parity with the fossil equivalent.
Absolutely. Yeah, the future of synthetic fuels generally, the technology exists today to make them quite meaningfully cheaper than fossil fuel, liquid fuel prices before the Iran conflict. This is well understood. It's not controversial. It's just never been scaled beyond the academic literature and early prototyping. Now, also, there are other advantages, economic advantages to synthetic fuel. Our feedstocks are water, carbon, and energy. If we have stable contracts for all of those inputs over the course of 10 or 20 years, that gives us a predictable price. Low cost volatility. Volatility is extreme, and we're seeing it play out in the fossil supply chains today. Also, as I mentioned, the fuel is a higher purity. It's a molecularly pure fuel without adulterants like copper, cadmium, lead, other things you don't want to emit into the atmosphere, but they also adulterate your engine and turbine performance. And so we get more thrust per kilogram by our fuel because of its molecular purity. That means that airlines could fly with lighter fuel payloads and still fly the same distance, double dipping their efficiencies. So there's a lot of structural advantages to synthetic fuel. The cost will become economically self-interested within our lifetimes, for sure. And we're hoping that Syntholene can make that happen, make that a reality within the next 5 years.
Yeah, and volatility is expensive, as we know. So, sorry, Richard, go ahead.
I was going to say, and obviously within that pricing, you've included the value of the carbon.
We've included the value of the carbon. We've included the value of the carbon at a premium price. And we've also anticipated the cost reduction in that carbon, hopefully, as we create a circular economy for it. But yeah, I know it's a lot to swallow, but this is really real. We're proving it in the field right now. And we're looking forward to being able to present the finality of these results, justifying that cost competition before, the end of Q4 this year, maybe early Q4.
Yeah,
I don't want to hold your time, Dan, but just one final question. What price would you put that carbon?
We just spoke about sort of 250 euros per ton, and then coming down to 100 or even sub 100 over time, over the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So, and that I've just also done a recording today with UK SAF clearinghouse. So we're also we talked about the difference between technology readiness level and fuel readiness level. As Syntholene, as mentioned, the technology, it's Fischer-Tropsch, it's technology that is, some of it is not new, so it is about integration, and then it is about making that fuel ready, rather than the individual parts of the technology. So I will also send this information out with the recording as well, but this is also important for banks, investors to know about fuel readiness level rather than just technology readiness level. I think this leads us nicely onto speaking to Ryan at White Case, because Ryan has been working on, thank you, Dan, for the information, and feel free to continue with Ryan now, but Ryan has been working through different contracting, working through the contracting of many SAF development projects and actually also eFuels projects. So Ryan, would you like to kind of let us also, I guess, what we discussed before, like what are the challenges and advice you would have for producers, and what's your experience so far? Like, so Dan has explained his status, and of course it is going into a demonstration, which then once demonstrated will be, the Syntholene will be looking for investment, scale up, of course, towards a financial investment decision where it gets the commercialized. So what's your, and if you want to maybe talk about some of the background of the eFuel projects that are getting to FID, then it would be great to hear your experience, Ryan.
Yeah, sure. So thanks very much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for spending your time with us this afternoon. So my name's Ryan Goverick. I'm a local partner at international law firm White Case based in Hamburg, and I am a project development and M&A lawyer by background. But as Sarah said, in a very privileged position over the last 18 to 24 months to help a variety of producers throughout the Americas, Asia, the Middle East, and Europe bring various sustainable aviation fuel projects to FID and achieve financing. Full disclosure, those projects to date have been HEFA-based or at least alcohol-to-jet based. And that's largely, as Dan was saying before, a product of where the market currently is, where the cost curve currently is, for HEFA and alcohol-to-jet versus e-fuels. That being said, the firm has also been assisting both lenders and sponsors on some of the e-fuel projects around the world that are very, very close to FID at the moment, but not quite there just yet. And I think Dan hit the nail on the head. It's largely about cost when it comes to eSAF. The cost competitiveness and the pricing with eSAF being roughly, 5 to 7 times A1 kerosene is making it very, very difficult to secure long-term offtake contracts that are necessary to underpin the financing of those facilities themselves. Where we are seeing movement with those offtake contracts is, as Dan mentioned, it is in jurisdictions that have that cost competitiveness when you're looking at the price of renewable electricity. But it's not just sort of the pure availability of low cost power. It's also the proximity to key markets as well. So that's key markets for technology and construction. So our construction prices relatively low, and also for the product itself, looking at it from a carbon intensity point of view, from the actual transportation of the fuel from one jurisdiction to another, is it fairly proximate to key aviation fuel demand centers as well. So looking at and honing in on Europe, it's unsurprising that most of the eSAF projects in Europe at the moment that are very close to FID are all in the Nordics. There are a number of projects also in the Iberian Peninsula as well, but the traditional jurisdictions that have very, very low cost power. You do have some pilot and demonstration projects in other parts of Europe. Germany, for example, they are, as I said, they're very much a pilot stage, as opposed to being sort of in excess of 250,000 tons per annum of fuel production, which is really where most of the large-scale projects, whether it's HEFA or eSAF, are currently targeting at the moment. They're looking at around 250,000 tons per annum of SAF. And to give you sort of an idea of, at least in the heifer market, what we've been seeing is that there's a huge difference in the actual cost of these type of projects. So a heifer project, like those that the firm has been working on in Pakistan and Egypt, has very, very low cost of production, very, very low construction costs as well. And when using a very well-known and stable technology, again, very low cost base. And those facilities are, realistically looking at about, when it comes to sort of debt sizing, assuming sort of a 60-40 debt to equity ratio, you're looking at debt packages of around $200 to $300 million. Now, when you compare that with some of the European projects, it's suddenly 700 to $1 billion for the same size project. So again, those type of economics are what's really playing out in the projects that are getting to FID at the moment.
Okay, that's good to know. And then I think we've seen that some of the projects are closer to FID, but actually it is the challenge for eFuels is still. Well, so what would you say? What are you seeing the price of the eFuel SAF is currently sitting at? Is that part of Yeah,
it's. I think the interesting thing with the eFuel contracts that are being negotiated at the moment, I'm not aware of any that have actually been finalized in terms of the offtake contracts for eSAF.
Yeah.
But the models that are being sort of explored are much more complex than their sort of heifer alternatives. From a pricing perspective, again, it really depends on how the project is being structured and who the off-taker is. What we are seeing is the projects that are looking to get closer to FID compared to others will usually have an airline in the equity. So that creates somewhat of a distortion on the pricing for the offtake for the project itself. But I would say you're still roughly looking for that pricing at, I'd say, anything from 4 to 7 times the jet fuel, the A1 jet fuel price currently. Now, that's still rather expensive, which is why those type of structures where you have the synergies of equity offtake are those that are getting away at the moment, because they are able to sign up for 10 to 15 year contracts with the airlines to underpin the financing of those projects.
Yeah.
Why are those particular airlines willing to sign up to those type of contracts, given that the usual fuel procurement cycle for airlines is much more truncated? We're talking 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, depending on the airline, depending on their fuel strategy. And what we're really seeing is that the biggest purchasers of SAF outside of North America are the likes of, your KLM, Air France, DHL. Sorry, yeah, KLM posted about their investment in Inertec eSAF project yesterday. So just to draw that in. Yeah, sorry, carry on. No, you're right. But those airlines, if you take a step back and actually look at their fuel procurement strategy, it's I would say probably far more mature than other players within the market. So they are definitely looking at the differentials between fossil fuel and the volatility in the fossil fuel market versus your sustainable aviation fuel market.
Mm-hmm.
Fundamentally, you've got different feedstocks here that you can hedge differently. So the general conventional wisdom here is that while you may have volatility in the conventional jet market, that same volatility is not necessarily going to be seen in the UCO price. It's not necessarily going to be seen in electricity prices. So that gives you, when you start to move your procurement timelines from 3, 6, 12 months to longer term durations, it's giving a degree of predictability and stability to that fuel portfolio. Now, that only works if you are an incredibly large airline with an incredibly large fuel supply footprint. So,
Yeah.
you know, your logistics airlines, your DHLs are perfect sort of customers for this type of product and are actively looking at it. They also don't necessarily have the same ability as some of other airlines with their in terms of reducing and decarbonisation of their operations. So they are very much looking at SAF as the way forward, as well as from a regulatory compliance perspective. And then that also leads into very interesting constructs that are being explored at the moment with your passenger airlines around sort of the voluntary market as well, and how various structures with the voluntary market and particularly corporate travellers can help subsidise some of the pricing as well, which makes them more amenable to taking on board the higher pricing and locking it in over a longer term as well.
Yeah, so it sounds like from an airline perspective, it's a if, of course, the larger the airline, the more they can absorb and play around with longer term contracting.
Exactly, and it's the more likely that they have a sophisticated portfolio of fuel supplies.
Yeah, and it's of course looking at the analytics. So I've been working with Warwick University and University of Amsterdam on the fuel pricing, carbon pricing, looking at also capex, operating costs of SAF production plants. So it's of course, and then actually last week at an impact event, UCL were showing us the operating models of airlines and what percent was fuel and what they can essentially play around with. So it, of course, when there is a level of sophistication, as you said, or just magnitude, that these aspects can be played around with from an economics point of view. Also, actually, IATA did mention that only 80 out of 1,000 airlines have good creditworthiness.
Yep.
So again, that's something that I know, having worked with different lessors,
Yep.
that's a risk for finance. Again, it's the same for SAF producers.
And that's also driving what we're seeing. So I've just been talking about some of the models with airlines as the off-takers. I think the reality is that a lot of the large-scale SAF projects that are taking FID, that are getting financing in the last 18 to 24 months, I would probably say that of those, of all the projects, probably 75% of them, the off-takers are actually your fuel traders. So it's your Shells, your Trafiguras, your Totals of the world. And the reason for that is very much this creditworthiness point, because most of the airlines are not the most creditworthy counterparties, and that is one of the key bankability criteria for your lenders when they're looking at your portfolio of offtakes from your project. So I think that is where sometimes a lot of developers run into issues when they are sort of pre-feed, heading into feed, and then looking at securing financing. They struggle at that phase, because what is really important is having all of your ducks in a row in terms of having your offtake strategy very, very clear and aligning with the expectations of lenders. So lenders want to see the long-term offtake contracts with creditworthy counterparties. They want to see volume and price certainty built into those structures, at least to service the debt. That means that some of the more innovative structures that certain producers are looking at, they're not able to get away with that just yet because of the nascent stage of the market.
Mm-hmm.
Now, revenue support mechanisms, the revenue certainty mechanism in the UK, the double-sided auction process that is proposed under the EU also helps reduce some of that price reduces the pricing that makes it more attractive for customers. But at the same time, that pricing still has to work for lenders. It has to work for your economic model. You've got to be able to service your debt. And that is what lenders will very much be laser focused on throughout the entire process. And I think that, at least what we have been seeing is a lot of the producers are not necessarily engaging with that off-taking strategy early enough, and thinking ahead to what is actually going to be required from a bankability perspective from lenders.
Yeah. So this is a web of there's a lot of disentangling that has been required, and of course it's modeling everything, it's understanding, it's doing the analytics of the fuel pricing, hedging, and yeah, voluntary. So again, it was a comment from the IATA and the various lessors, all the groups, that there are not enough voluntary mechanisms. I'm just gonna skip forward, because actually that is what FGA is developing. It's a voluntary way to bring funds into the SAF market through our platform called Drops. That will be developed later, but I just want to kind of drop in that we've been looking at that modeling, and that it is complex, but it does require creativity, innovation in funding. It, as you've described, Ryan, it is of course structuring finance. Actually, Rachel, who was on the call, she structures finance she's worked in hydrogen, and SAF is a new part of her development work. And the conversations I'm having with groups are usually that they've worked in hydrogen or in other renewables like wind. We've mentioned here there are similar mechanisms that have been in play, revenue certainty, auctions, all of these mechanisms are not new. You've mentioned, Ryan, and they can be borrowed from other sectors. In FGA's report in 2022, we added the offshore wind case study, so you can have a look at that case study in our SAF mechanisms report. So it really is borrowing, being agile, but really what you've been doing, I guess, Ryan, is crunching through different approaches. Do you?
We have been.
Yeah.
We have been. I think, the UK model and what has been proposed, and the way in which sort of the interface between the UK mandates, the revenue certainty mechanism, and then also the UK ETS is actually creating the right type of ecosystem in the UK market for the development of these SAF projects. So I think that from a policy lever perspective, that it is a multi-pronged approach. For producers themselves, going back to Dan's point, there's cost advantages of different jurisdictions, different technologies, as well as the jurisdictional advantages of what type of support mechanisms are available, as well as proximity to markets. So all of that has to be factored into it, while having the technology that can achieve scalability, as Dan has said. That already exists. It's not the technology that is the problem here. It is the strategy and the constructs that sit around the development of these projects from a route to market, offtake, and financing perspective.
Yeah, and then if you have favorable conditions such as Syntholene, and you can get that price as close to equity as possible, that is fantastic. If you're another pathway that is using higher cost feedstock, then we need other voluntary mechanisms as well to enable. They still work because we do have things like an abundance of waste that we can use. Plastics to SAF is going through the certification process, so there is an absolute abundance of and complete waste of plastics material. So there is going to be different pathways, and I also just did message European Commission today with this mechanism, which is supporting airlines to cover the cost of it. Cost of SAF. They're also going to work on how this works, is developed. So at the moment, it can support paying for SAF. However, as we mentioned, Ryan, actually the projects are not using that mechanism at the moment as a stacking it as a known subsidy. So there are benefits and kind of there are benefits to the mechanisms, but there's also ways that the mechanisms can evolve. Revenue certainty mechanism, it's legislated, but the kind of mechanics behind it are still being evolved. So that will benefit projects such as LanzaJet, Lighthouse Green Fuels. I know that Firefly is almost certified with their new HTL pathway. So just lots of good progress here, and I think it is really important and good to discuss new cases such as Syntholene. So yeah, here is Syntholene, and also I find it always very, very helpful to speak to the lawyers. So thank you, Ryan. If anybody
That'd be it first.
I think so good. So if anybody, and unfortunately we had a bit of a link issue so we may have lost some people along the way at the beginning, but if anybody has some questions, Richard.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. The inevitable cost of all of this ends up with either the corporate cargoes or with the consumer, one of the two. And as far as the cargoes are concerned, which I'm particularly interested in, they're going to be bound by Scope 3. So how does this lot get rationalised, where you've got the drive for Scope 3, you've got an increased cost over the cost of a jet A1 as it stands, and basically the consumer's going to pay. So where's the balance in your mind going to be for this?
That is a good question. That is a tricky one. Look, I think that ultimately it's coming back to the broader issues associated with decarbonisation across the board. Is that from a societal perspective, are we looking at this as something that is a universal good? And if so, who's actually ultimately having to pay for that? So on the one hand, yes, you do have the customers paying for it. On the other hand, a lot of the subsidy mechanics that are being worked through to help the industry get up on its feet are also going to be paid by the taxpayer in one way or another. So from that perspective, I think it is ultimately a social cost that is going to be borne by everyone. In terms of the Scope 3 emissions and the issues around Scope 3 emissions and managing those emissions generally, I think it's quite interesting that when you talk to different players within the sort of aviation space at the moment, perhaps the players that are most concerned with potential future Scope 3 liability are not the airlines themselves, but actually the airports and the airport owners. And the rationale behind that is largely that they have very, very limited ability to reduce their Scope 3 emissions other than through the deployment of sustainable aviation fuel. And that's particularly important for airports like Heathrow and Sydney that actually own their fuel infrastructure, because a lot of the airports worldwide don't. So for those airports, they are very much looking at, they're another source of demand for SAF, insofar as if you take the Heathrow model and the way in which the third-party access regime works for Heathrow for fuel supply, Heathrow is incentivizing the deployment of SAF through that option system for the fuel farms to potentially not only have greater SAF in the portfolio of what Heathrow makes available, but it's also potentially reducing their Scope 3 liability long term.
Yeah.
A win-win.
Win-win, yeah.
Yeah, we need more.
But there again, they have increased, in fact, the ground handling charges by 50%. So to compensate, so I mean, they're
yes, it's not entirely.
And interestingly, Ryan and I were at a passenger experience conference, so it was an interesting, just different angle to because I went to present the work we've been doing and about how to think differently about including the passenger in voluntary. And also I went to a hotel conference recently, and when I said what kind of work I was doing, many groups, even working in travel, said, oh, is this greenwashing work that airlines are doing? So even though, there's so much work to do still on making sure that the work is known, the work is, technically approved, but also that people are knowing what's happening and that airlines are working on it, as well as trying to figure out these complex structures and development projects. David, would you like to?
Yeah, just a quick question. First of all, thank everyone for really interesting chat and insights here. Really interesting to just get an update on everything. Question I had is regarding the current situation in the Gulf and obviously the fuel shortage issue. I'm just wondering to what extent that's shaping the conversations that you're having with investors, with others. Is there sort of an interest or durable interest in terms of investing in SAV, partly because of the crisis? Do you think that's something you can build on, or is it sort of maybe a temporary glitch, temporary interest?
I can speak to that, as we have had a lot of inbound interest and changes in conversational tone over the course of the last couple of months. Now, first and foremost, immediate price spikes that come with supply interruptions, those are going to be temporary, hopefully. But I think we are seeing the perception of longer term risk premiums that are now going to have to be baked in. Also, we've got essentially a jet fuel supply chain in Europe that has a single point of failure. That's going to have its own risk profile. We're seeing airlines cancel flights. I think the idea of a hedge against centralized jet fuel production in the Middle East, potential conflict risk, does that conflict risk become less in the next 10, 20, 50 years or more? It sounds like a good idea, but unless there is a real and material pathway to cost competition with fossil fuels, even with that risk premium baked in, it's still perceived as an expensive science experiment at 7 to 10 times the price of fossil jet. So the idea that decentralized production in democratic nations, in friendly nations, in places that are more politically reliable or bankable with lower risk of supply chain interruption sounds awesome. There probably will be an investment premium attached to that. But technologies like Syntholene have never been more critical. We need to be able to show that any green premium, whether it's borne by the consumer or the taxpayer, whoever, it needs to be temporary. It needs to be a bridge to cost competition. And if that bridge is true and material and provable and bankable, then the idea of increased energy sovereignty and increased decentralization away from politically risky regions, it's definitely front foremost on investors' minds, and we're fielding those conversations every day.
Yeah, and the conversations that I've had, basically, it just puts it on the radar of the analysts, and it's just because everybody's talking about it, so you cannot miss it. And then the first question is this going to affect? For me, is this going to change your work or affect it? It is the reason. It's one of the main reasons for it in the very first place. So I think and then if you look at the JP.
Sorry to interrupt. I've got to jump. Great to talk to you guys. Thanks so much. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
So nice to meet you all.
Dan, thank you. And then if you look at the JP Morgan investment strategy, it's all about energy resilience and independence. So there's it's present. So it is another factor, another driver for ensuring the projects that do get pushed through. But at the end of the day, as Ryan and Dan have mentioned, it's still about the economics and the structure of the project. But it is definitely in mind to get them pushed through quicker, of course, because like the price of aviation fuel has at least doubled. So as a long-term strategy for airlines, then it is being discussed at the aviation events.
I think the one thing that I totally agree with what Dan and Sarah have been saying, but I think the one really, really interesting thing that has come out of this is that, yes, on the one hand, there's greater awareness of the energy security argument, but when you actually look at the offtake structures and the offtake pricing, the weird thing that has been happening is that the SAF prices have not actually...
Yeah, no, carry on.
Sorry.
No, carry on, Brian. I just had a thought.
The SAF prices have not actually dropped relative to the jet fuel prices. So while the UCO, and this is mostly in the heifer market, while the used cooking oil prices have been fairly stable throughout this period, the SAF prices have gone up and down in line with the fossil fuel price.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is a lot of the spot SAF contracts that are actually out in the market at the moment, and a lot of the early SAF long-term offtake contracts were all index linked to the jet fuel price. So that when the jet fuel price goes up or down, the SAF price in those contracts is also going up and down. So that's been a bit of a structural fault that a lot of observers in the market have been looking at, that, you know, contrary to what everyone expected, the SAF price hasn't actually operated in the way people thought it would. And when you actually crack open those earlier contracts, you see why. They're index linked as opposed to being and jet fuel linked as opposed to being linked to the UCO price plus your cost of production, or UCO plus a premium, or however you want to structure that.
Yeah, and that is what we're also monitoring with drops, and to make an even playing field, and that is an aspect of our platform. So yeah, I think great discussion, really good information. Thanks, Ryan, for today, and also being at the conference in April. I think it's really good information to get out also to people that are not always in the weeds. It's important to see that the work is pushing forward, and that yeah, the market is starting to be made. So thank you for those who joined. The recording will be sent out as well as notes. Yep, we'll see you at the next well, yeah, I will hopefully see everybody at the SAF Congress next week, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you for joining. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.